And AI is one of these things, especially kind of the large language models, where what we are doing essentially is taking huge amounts of text, pouring it into these things, and then these models are generating this latent space of like words and concepts and ideas, and they are all connected and kind of they're all located in these different spaces. And I think the really cool thing about this is that you can then navigate this large space. You can actually find relationships between different ideas that maybe regular scientists or individuals would never actually notice. And so for me, I view it as, even if we stopped and we just had all of the literature as is, I actually think we could find a huge amount of new knowledge just through navigating this latent space of knowledge.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. And today in front of me is Samuel Arbesman. Samuel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be chatting with you.
I'm excited, and your voice is coming crisp and clear. So it's great to have you here. And we're gonna discuss a lot of topics revolving tech, AI, magic. And first of all, I would love to begin with, an idea that talks about the half-life of facts. And you reveal that knowledge in fields like medicine has measurable expiration dates. How does this idea affect AI, affect discoveries in 2025? How do you think this half-life is shortening, or is it increasing?
Yeah, and I guess to take a step back in terms of kind of how to think about sort of this half-life idea, the idea behind it is, by analogy with radioactive materials, that while I cannot, if you give me an atom of uranium, for example, I can't predict when that specific atom is going to decay. It could be in the next fraction of a second, it could be a very long time, millions of years, or whatever it is. But things change when we take a whole bunch of atoms and put them together, and you get an entire chunk of uranium. Suddenly, there ends up being a certain amount of regularity to the decay. In fact, you can actually chart this out as the half-life, and they're encapsulated in a single number. And for me, it turns out you can do a similar kind of thing in thinking about how knowledge changes over time in terms of how facts are overturned, how we learn new things, how error is rooted out. There are kind of these regularities. And so that's kind of the half-life. And it turns out, specifically when it comes to when knowledge gets overturned or become obsolete, people have actually measured this kind of thing in certain areas. Now, in terms of as we have new technologies, how that affects how knowledge changes over time, I would say a number of different ways. And so it turns out one of the aspects in the way in which we learn new things is we have better tools and instruments and measurement techniques. And so as we have better technologies for that, it will actually change how we learn new things. Whether or not that will shorten the half-life or increase it, I don't know. But I would say one thing in terms of thinking about the regularities, so not necessarily the half-life of knowledge, but in terms of the regularities of how we learn new things, I would say one aspect of AI that could be very useful is in terms of stitching together bits of knowledge. And well before kind of the modern AI, there was this great paper from the mid-1980s by this information scientist, Don Swanson, and it was called Undiscovered Public Knowledge. And the idea behind this was he kind of created this like thought experiment. He said, okay, imagine somewhere in the scientific literature, there's a paper that says A implies B. And then somewhere else in the literature, there's another paper that says B implies C. Because the literature is so big, like no one has actually read all these papers, there's undiscovered public knowledge. There's knowledge that if you would actually connect to them, and it might very well be true that A implies C, but because no one has actually read both papers, we don't really know. The nice thing is he was actually not content leaving it as a thought experiment. He actually did, and he used kind of like the cutting edge techniques of the day, which was like keyword searches in some medical databases. But he actually found some interesting relationships. I think it was related to treating a circulatory disorder using by consuming fish oil, and he actually published it, I think, in a medical journal, even though he was not a physician. And the interesting thing is, of course, we have come a very long way since these just kind of keyword searches. And AI is one of these things, especially kind of the large language models, where what we are doing essentially is taking huge amounts of text, pouring it into these things, and then these models are generating this latent space of like words and concepts and ideas, and they are all connected and kind of they're all located in these different spaces. And I think the really cool thing about this is that you can then navigate this large space. You can actually find relationships between different ideas that may be regular science.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to interrupt this episode. I have a huge announcement that I'll be sharing with you just now. My first book ever is out now, called The Time Is Now, a guide to honor your time on Earth. This was a 2-year project that's been in the works. It's a tough love guide to honor your time on Earth. This book will show you how to reclaim your time and energy for what truly matters. Click the link in the show notes and you're gonna see also the link to the domain here, timeisnowbook.com. Order a copy for your loved ones, and I'm so excited for you to dive into it. Thank you.
Scientists or individuals would never actually notice. And so for me, I view it as, even if we should definitely keep on doing lots and lots of research, but even if we stopped and we just had all the literature as is, I actually think we could find a huge amount of new knowledge just through navigating this latent space of knowledge. And actually people have done some research by looking at, I think it was in material science, they poured in a whole bunch of data, papers, and using, I think, based on keywords and certain things, and as well as kind of this latent space. And they found that discovering that if they had used AI, they would have actually known that some material had some specific property several years earlier before someone actually discovered it, simply by, or at least they could have hypothesized it, simply because of the fact that these materials were kind of in close proximity in this latent space to the concept of this specific property. And so for me, I don't know about in terms of like overturning things that are incorrect, but I would definitely say one of the profound things that I think AI will allow us to do is to stitch together lots of bits of knowledge, as well as overcome jargon barriers. So one of the interesting things that we think, like everything is online, all this knowledge is out there, we should think, therefore, everything is going to be easily findable. The truth is, if you don't even know the terms to look, to use to search, you'll never find the things you're actually looking for. So I remember this back in when I was a postdoc. Me and another postdoc were working on some research, and we needed some specific way of clustering data. And we couldn't figure it out. We searched a little bit. They were like, okay, we'll make something. It's not going to necessarily be that good, but this will be the technique we use. And then right before we were about to do it, I said, let's just talk to the statistician down the hall. And we went and spoke to him, and I feel like in under a minute, he told us the exact thing we needed. And it was because we didn't even know what to search for. And I think, and you see this kind of thing where certain mathematical models will be reinvented many, many times in different fields because people don't even realize what's happening in the adjacent fields. And I think AI will really provide mechanisms for allowing knowledge to kind of jump from one domain to another, allow us to stitch things together, and hopefully accelerate this kind of knowledge. So I don't necessarily know if things will be overturned, but I definitely think there are interesting potential avenues for AI-assisted scientific discovery, AI-assisted hypothesis generation, potentially even computationally generated experiments. I think there's a lot of really interesting developments on the horizon when it comes to AI and science.
Yeah, and it's interesting because yesterday I hosted Nick Chafer and he was Nick Chatter. He was we were discussing the mind is flat and cognitive scientist and how he sees AI as the mirror of our mind. There's not a lot of depth. It's just superficial thoughts, and AI LLMs reflect that. And what I'm hearing from you is, AIs might be able to spark curiosity and creativity within us in ways that we don't envision. And so how do you see, the tool is right there, but how can we truly leverage and take the best out of it when it comes to, not confirming our biases and just allowing it to, explore those open-ended questions that, allow hypotheses to truly, real ones and original ones to come through.
Yeah, and so I think, I agree with what you were saying. This idea that when we pour all these texts into the AI systems, they're going to have biases. They're going to be incomplete. They're also going to be reflections of ourselves, but not even, and so less in terms of reflections of reality, but more so in terms of the reflections of the way we tell stories or the way we use language. And the way we use language is not necessarily the way in which the world actually operates. And I think we kind of need to, and people have written about these kinds of things. I've written a little bit about this as well in terms of like distinguishing like reality and kind of the story world, or people talk about the like semiotic physics, where if you ask an LLM to generate random numbers, it's not going to generate statistically random numbers. It's going to generate numbers that kind of feel random, but are actually incredibly biased in certain ways. But the kind of random numbers you might read about in a story, as opposed to actually generated by a truly random process. And people have also written about how certain narrative tropes and narrative devices that we use in our stories, those are the kinds of things that are very attractive to these language models. And so I think we kind of, we have to distinguish between story world and the world around us. But at the same time, though, I do think that these kinds of tools can be very, very useful for kind of being partners in creativity, and kind of like there's like this human machine partnership with creativity, where it's, I mean, I am hesitant to say like any AI will never be able to do X, Y, or Z, because of course, like in 10 minutes, we'll find out that they can actually do those kinds of things. And so for me, it's, and I would never want to say, oh, humans are like, this is the one thing that is unique. I mean, we see this also even just in like talking about the animal kingdom of like, oh, human beings are the only creatures that, I don't know, can use tools or do X, Y, and Z or whatever it is. And of course, then we discover that other animals can use tools, or other animals can have certain linguistic abilities, and suddenly we don't actually look so unique anymore. And I feel like the same kind of thing people are realizing with AI. But so for me, it's more about, okay, how can we use these tools to kind of be the best versions of ourselves? And being able to, and I think in some ways, the fact that these systems hallucinate, that is actually really good for kind of like the divergent process within brainstorming and generating ideas. Like if you say, okay, give me some creative, like interesting ideas or things I should be considering, some of the things they'll come up with are kind of nonsense, but that's okay, especially when it's kind of in that sort of creative process. When you're trying to find actual facts, that's an entirely different thing, and then you have to be much more careful. But the truth is, sometimes like you don't necessarily even need to go as far as a sophisticated AI system to kind of jolt you out of the current paths that you're thinking in order to make you a little bit more creative. You can use simple random processes. You can say, okay, here is a list of interesting things. Now just take a few of the, like choose a few randomly and say, how would I recombine those? And that can actually be a very interesting creative process. I actually have a tool that I don't really use that actively, but I have this thing. So a number of years ago, I found a way to digitize the names and the kind of like ISBN codes of all the books that I own. So it's out of date. And so certain books I have not been included, other books I no longer have. But what I did was I built this little tool to just basically I think it's Monday morning, it emails me 5 randomly chosen books that I should reconsider. Because the truth is, even if I read these books very carefully, I often had a specific reason I was reading those books at the time. And of course, I change. And so it's useful sometimes to just to re-examine those books, or at least consider re-examining them. And so I still get those emails. I don't really do much with them. But I think this idea of kind of just like these sparks of randomness of, oh, you maybe thought about this book for some other reason years ago, and now you should actually look at it now. That in itself can be a really good sort of spur to creativity. And of course, this is brain dead compared to any of the current AI tools. So for me, and certainly the AI tools can be very, very powerful in terms of sparking different ideas or creating sort of serendipitous connections. But they can also go hand in hand with much simpler computational processes as well.
Yeah, and that brings me to, your most recent book, The Magic of Code, and, how magic is right in our computers. You just wrote a Substack article. It was really interesting to read, and I would love for listeners to get a glimpse into, what do you mean by the magic of code, and if there's, if we can find magic within, our keyboards.
Yeah, and so I think the title kind of it captures a number of different things. So I would say the first aspect is the fact that when I think about our like the way in which we kind of talk about technology and computing right now, there's, especially at the societal level, there's to a certain degree somewhat of a broken conversation where most people they're they're adversarial towards technology, or they're very worried about it, or sometimes they're just ignorant about it and kind of saying things that are just kind of plain wrong. And the truth is, a certain amount of adversarial or worry or concern, that's fair. But when I think about my own experiences growing up with computing, it wasn't just full of worry. It was full of wonder and delight. And I also didn't even feel like computation was just this kind of branch of engineering. I felt like it was this weird humanistic liberal art that when I thought about it, it actually connected everything from language and philosophy and biology and art and how we think, all these different things together. And so for me, computing, right, it's not just like writing algorithms or being worried that our smartphones are destroying our minds. It's also SimCity and fractals and the Commodore VIC-20 and early Macintosh and all these different kinds of things. And so for me, when I think about kind of the magic of code, there is this sense of, okay, it is kind of this magical, wondrous kind of thing that, of course, I mean, we need to have more utilitarian, large enterprise software. And these kinds of things often go hand in hand. Like, I don't think it's an either or kind of thing. Then there's also like, how do we think about magic itself? And so like magic is like sorcery. And the truth is, when we think about like the stories we have told or the desires we've had for millennia around using language and text to kind of coerce the world around us, it turns out, I mean, while these have been wonderful stories, only in the past, I don't know, 75, 80 odd years or so, has this actually been a reality. Like since kind of the advent of the modern digital computer, where we can actually write code, we can actually use text, and it can actually have an effect. It can have an effect on the screen. It can have an effect in the world around us. And so for me, one of the things I did, and actually I discussed this kind of relatively early on in the book, is around taking that analogy seriously and saying, okay, what are the ways people have thought about magic and sorcery and spellcraft and all these different kinds of things? And are there ways, and truly try to understand that, and can we use these ideas to actually better understand how we think about coding and computation and programming? And of course, I mean, you don't want to push the analogy too far, but I think there actually is a lot of really interesting things. So for example, I mean, when we think about code, I mean, like oftentimes when we say magic, kind of, especially in technology, it's like, oh, it's magical, it kind of just works. And there's something to be said for that. But the truth is, when you look at how people thought about magic and like our fantasy tales or whatever, I mean, it didn't just work. It actually required effort. Like it required craft and learning and sometimes apprenticeship. And so, and you went to Hogwarts for 7 years, or you learned with a master wizard or whatever it was. And the same kind of thing is true in coding. And like, you have to actually learn computer science to a certain degree. Of course, there are things around like democratizing code, and we can discuss that later if that makes sense. But there's also other things around like names and how we think about variables, or certain things around the idea of sacrifice, of like something of value must be given up. And certainly with our AI systems right now, I mean, we are clearly providing huge amounts of creative materials to allow these systems to work. And is that sacrifice worth it? That's a whole conversation that people are having kind of within the creative world. And yeah, so anyway, this is, and when I think about kind of magic, I think about like the ways in which we kind of take this idea seriously and use this as a means for better understanding our own computers, as well as kind of the broader technologies, as well as how we actually program these machines and get them to kind of actually do the things we do.
Wow. Yeah, and it seems as though, for the first part of of what magic constitutes, it seems that, I think of how these systems might be, are making us more resilient, or more, are becoming more fragile. For example, you've written about how when the Microsoft outage happened, it makes me question, are we creating systems that are making us too reliable in this magic, or over reliable, or are we able to just unplug it, quote unquote, and create magic outside of the screen? Because if that kind of situation happens, now that it's growing more and more powerful, and we're putting so much of us into it, what will happen if not to go into the scary side of the equation, but what will happen if once we become too addicted to this magic of producing this magic? What do you think will happen there?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I'm not really sure we can kind of build like either smaller systems or kind of or opt out of all these technologies as a whole. I mean, so yeah, related to kind of the Microsoft outage when it happened a year or so ago, it was not as much like, oh, we are like we've kind of built these horrible things. It was more just kind of that outage made us aware that we are living in this world of huge amounts of interconnection and systems that are probably more complex than we might have realized. And I think to a certain degree, that's probably the best we can do with some of these kinds of technologies, where we have built this mass. And so the computer scientist Stanley Hillis kind of talks about how we moved from the Enlightenment to the entanglement. And I feel like we're building these highly entangled systems where everything is kind of interconnected, and we don't really fully understand the implications for how these systems are stitched together. So for me, and I would say there's kind of two possible reactions. The first one is simply trying to be more aware and conscious of this entanglement that we live inside. Because I think for most people, it's really, it's something they don't think about oftentimes until something goes wrong. And then you're kind of confronted with, oh, wow, these systems are actually much, much more sophisticated than we might have realized. And so, for example, I remember, this is back, I think when the Apple Watch first came out, there was this article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal somewhere, like the style section around like whether or not people are going to still wear mechanical watches. And of course, I mean, people are going to still wear mechanical watches, but they interviewed this one guy who was a fan of mechanical watches, and he said, oh, of course I want to wear a mechanical watch. I think about how sophisticated it is as opposed to a smartwatch, which is just a chip. And I'm thinking, like, just a chip.
And I'm excited to also announce that I'm going to open through conversations to a members exclusive section only, where you'll be able to access episodes earlier. I'm going to create so many perks for you that I'm excited for. I wanted to get the best value possible, and I've been thinking on how to do it. I want to give you access to early videos. I want to give you also access to, when I record an interview, that you have access real time to just watch while we record, and also to have a live stream, meaning that you can tune in and ask your own questions, your Q&A to some of your favorite guests, and also some of the guests that you don't really know yet, but you would love to hear. And also that way you have some sort of skin in the game as you're supporting the podcast in some way, and you're more invested in the success of it. And so I'm excited for this.
These things are orders of magnitude more complex than mechanical watches, but we've been shielded from that complexity. And I think that kind of viewpoint is true for most of our technologies, is that we use all these things and they're very sophisticated and very powerful, but we don't realize how complex and interconnected they fully are. And so for me, I would say just having a greater deal of awareness of the sophistication and the complexity of the systems, I think can go a long way towards being like not being blindsided when things go wrong, but also just having a greater appreciation for the sophistication, but also the limits of what these kinds of things can do. The other one, though, is also, I think there still is a certain amount of deliberateness and kind of agency that we can have in terms of our technologies. And when I think about like technological growth and technological progress, these things, I mean, they are very powerful forces, but they're not things that just kind of like wash over us. Like we have a certain choice in the technologies we adopt. And because ultimately, and for me, when I think about the technologies we adopt and how we kind of use these things, I mean, obviously I'm a big proponent of technology. I think a lot about computing. I actually think it's unbelievable and amazing. But at the same time, if you look back at the early decades of computing, the people who were kind of the luminaries there, they were not just kind of building these things because they were awesome. They were in service of very human needs of like education or simulation or understanding our world better or whatever it was. And because ultimately, and computers, they are meant for people. And if we kind of forget that kind of thing, it becomes much easier to just be enamored of the newer and faster gadget or whatever it is. And so I think I often return to, so there was this fantastic television show called *Halt and Catch Fire*, which was about, it came out, maybe it was about like a decade or so ago. It's about kind of like the early personal computing industry kind of goes from like, I think like 1980 to like the early to mid 90s. And I think possibly even in the first episode, one of the characters talks about, he's discussing the computer. He's like, the computer is not the thing. It's the thing that gets you to the thing. And like, it's all like computers are in service of whatever we want to do. And if we forget that, we we just kind of, we're missing something. We're missing something. And I think also to a certain degree, going hand in hand to that also requires a certain amount of wonder rather than just kind of taking things for granted. And so I'm reminded of my grandfather. He lived to the age of 99. He was a dentist, but he also read science fiction since basically like the modern dawn of the genre. He read everything. He read like Dune when it was like serialized in a magazine. Like nothing could surprise him. And I remember when the iPhone first came out, I went with my grandfather and my father to the Apple store, and we're playing with the iPhone. And then at a certain point, my grandfather says, he's like, this is it. Like, this is the object I've been reading about for all these years. And I feel like we've gone so quickly from realizing, oh, this thing is an object that feels like it was dropped from the future or kind of in our science fictional fantasies to, I don't know, complaining about camera resolution or battery life or whatever it is. And we kind of need both. You kind of need to say, okay, here are the limits. Going back to kind of like a true sense of the complexity of these technologies and like as well as their powers and their limitations. You need that, but you also need a sense of appreciating how far we've come and saying, "Oh, these things are amazing," but how do we kind of make them work for us? How do we make them work for us as people? And certainly, when it comes to like the realm of science fiction, it's how do we make sure the science fiction stories that we want to be building are the positive visions of the future, as opposed to kind of the more dystopian ones.
Yeah, 100%. It seems that now that we continue iterating on these technologies such as the iPhone, it seems as though taking it for granted is the norm, and just we're not in shock and all the time. We wouldn't be able to use it, you know?
Well, I was I think having a certain amount of like taken for granted is good,
Yeah.
but occasionally saying, oh wow, this is actually a pretty amazing thing is also, I think, can be fruitful in terms of our like creating the proper like balanced relationship with technology.
Yeah, and it allows us to look into them and how, like you say, we can use them for us and not just, to continue iterating on, consumer demands,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, even though it's our demands, it becomes more dull, and it allows us to flourish in creativity and curiosity and wonder and, throughout not only technology, but life itself. And, Sam, you've also you work right now at Lux Capital in the science realm, and you scout for startups. And I'm very curious to see, how are they using these new technologies? How are they using the AI, or, what are you looking for in terms of, the impact they will be having, the frontier startups, in terms of, igniting also not only creativity, but also liberating technology and, improving the world itself.
Yeah. And so I mean, there's a number of different ways. I think early on in kind of some of this like generative AI stuff, there was just a sense of, okay, we're going to kind of use this and apply it to everything. And you see this kind of thing in kind of the tech world whenever there is some new technology or new advance. There's a certain set of buzzwords that kind of get added to any startup of like, oh, we're not just a tech startup, we're now doing something with crypto, or we're doing something now with AI or whatever it is. And so there's a certain amount of trying to like filter out some of that kind of noise. But I think AI, I mean, there's both. I mean, going back to what I was saying, kind of like computers are for people, or it's like the thing that gets you to the thing. AI itself is a very powerful technology, but it's often you have to kind of say, okay, what am I using it in service of? Like, what is the end goal? Is it going to be for helping with scientific discovery, which is certainly one thing that we're seeing people talk about? Is it going to be for lowering the barrier or making software creation that much easier? Things like that. And I feel like those are the kind of directions that feel most fruitful, and actually related to like kind of like the software creation stuff. The truth is, I mean, there's one I was talking about kind of earlier about like the idea of like magic is kind of like, oh, like it requires a lot of effort and it's kind of like this like scribal elite or whatever it is. But there's also this idea of like democratizing magic. And actually, even if you look at like the Middle Ages, people were there were spells that could be done by kind of like the everyday user, where and you lost, I don't know, your cattle or whatever, and you could do some spell. And I feel like the same kind of thing has been desired in the realm of software and code, which is, on the one hand, yeah, we want, and writing software takes work, but can we make it easier? Can we allow the actual people kind of doing the things in their everyday to actually build software themselves for their own needs? And this is actually one of the interesting things. And where it's on the one hand, traditionally, if it required you to hire a huge number of software developers to build something, you often had to think about, okay, what is the software that is going to be useful for a very large market? And like, do I need it to be venture backed and kind of scale really rapidly? But there is also the idea of like, if you don't necessarily need to do that, if software development is that much easier and like everyday non-software developers can use it, then suddenly we have the potential for building software for yourself or for your loved ones. Or actually, the novelist Robin Sloan, he has this phrase from an essay of his that he wrote where it's this idea of like an app can be a home cooked meal. You don't necessarily have to be cooking for huge numbers of people or at like restaurant or industrial scale. You can just cook for yourself or for your loved ones at home. And there is something to be said for that. And I think this is actually one of the really interesting places where I think AI will actually shine, which is allowing people to build software for whatever use case they want. They no longer have to think in terms of building for a huge number of people. They can say, okay, I want to just build this thing for this specific use case. And then maybe when you're done, you just kind of allow it to evaporate or you just toss that piece of software away. And so for me, that kind of democratizing idea, which I mean has been around for a very long time in computing. And so you see this from like spreadsheets to HyperCard, kind of in the like early Macintosh days. Now with these generative AI tools that allow people to, like, whether it's vibe coding or even just like knowing how to write code, but then kind of using these things in partnership and making software development that much better, we now really see this possibility where people can actually just build whatever they want, however they want. And so it's one of these things where I actually think it's going to kind of these kinds of tools really have the possibility, going back to what we're talking about with creativity, of really unleashing human creativity. Because historically, if you didn't know how to program and you kind of went about your everyday life and you noticed certain things that maybe software could actually help you with, you kind of had to ignore that and kind of just set it aside because you couldn't build it. But now you don't have to worry about that. Now you actually can. Now, of course, there's still a lot of work to be done of because right now I think chatbots are maybe not the right mechanism for generating software. And so people are still working things out. But I am super excited and bullish around this kind of like vast democratization of writing code and generating software and kind of and really as sort of the kind of fulfillment of this idea of like computers are for people and software should be able to do all these different things. Now, when people have all these weird ideas that they want, they can now do these kinds of things. And so I mentioned before the Commodore VIC-20. So the Commodore VIC-20 was my family's first computer. I didn't know how to program it. I was very little. My father spent a long time with it and actually programmed, I think like educational tools and like I think he made like a flashcard kind of program for me to actually learn things. And that being said, like he needed to know how to program, but now we don't need that anymore, or at least to the same degree. And I think that's just going to open up so many possibilities. And so I'm super excited by that.
I'm curious to know, like, the democratizing effect is very intriguing. And what are some of the use cases or some of the weird, quirky ideas that you would like to see come out, from, let's say that would impact 10 people or 100 people?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the one, I would say, I'll kind of answer this. Well, I'll give some examples, but I can also answer it without answering, which is the nice thing about this is I can kind of be agnostic as to what these use cases are, because I'm not going to have all those answers. I can kind of like the whole thing is like it is the crowd. Like it is like each thing is going to kind of bubble up and be these kind of weird use cases. So for example, so in the essay that this novelist Robin Sloan, where he talks about this idea of an app can be a home cooked meal, he developed, I think it was like a video or photo sharing app, but just for his family. So I think it was like 5 people or something like that. And like that kind of thing is amazing. A number of years ago, I built a tool for my daughter at the time she was like learning how to read, and it was like kind of like showing her various like words she had to be able to recognize on site. And like that kind of thing, I mean, at the time, probably required a little bit of sophistication. Like it was not a complicated program at all, but like now it's going to be that much easier. But then you can also, yeah, like these kind of like learning tools, even just building games. So a number of months ago, I had this idea for a simple game, and I kind of developed it, and I started programming it kind of by hand. And then at a certain point, I was like, oh, I'm just going to use AI to kind of help me with this. And it got me most of the way there, and helped me a lot. And I kind of dove into the code a little bit. But it was one of these things where because AI helped me so much, I was able to make a working version of the game and quickly realize actually the game was not so much fun. And so I could say, okay, I tried it and kind of move on. And I think that kind of rapid ability to prototype ideas is also really powerful because I think a lot of people have really interesting ideas for software, or for the ways computers can be useful in their everyday lives. And sometimes those use cases actually don't measure up to reality. And the faster we can try those kinds of things, the better. Because we don't have to say, because like some people might say, oh, like I have this great idea. I'm going to go turn it into a company. I'm going to hire all these people. And then you quickly realize this is not something that actually people want or people want to use. If you can now do that kind of thing in an afternoon, then it's going to just avoid a huge amount of waste, but also just allow people to not necessarily sit on these ideas for as long. They can just try lots and lots of different things. And so I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting use cases. It's also, I also think AI generated kind of software is really good for allowing you to kind of stitch other pieces of software together. So like, let's say you have one program and you kind of want like the output of one program to be used by as the input of another or something like that. That forgiving kind of glue, and other people have talked about this kind of thing. That I think AI is really, really good for, in terms of like building kind of that like bridging sort of liminal software.
Yeah, and I'm gonna dive into a deeper philosophical question here, which is, going back into how we began our conversation is the stories and how we're creating stories and how we're living, we can live reality and we can also generate our own idea of what reality is. I'm curious to know, Sam, what do you think our technologies and the path of them currently as they are, what stories are they telling about ourselves?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of how I'm struggling with how to approach that. I would say, are you talking kind of like the vast sweep of technological history and kind of thinking about, okay, what do these things tell us about ourselves? Because I would say, ultimately, it's a story of like enhancement and trade-offs. So, like for example, like if you go back to like some of the very early technologies, like the alphabet and things like that. There were many people. I don't know if many people, but like I think in one of the Socratic dialogues, there's a moment where I believe Socrates is lamenting literacy as kind of ruining our memory. And I don't think anyone nowadays would be lamenting literacy, and literacy seems to be kind of this unalloyed good, where we can now like share information and store information and spread it far beyond the people that we know personally and as well as kind of across generations. But obviously it does come with a trade-off. And so where maybe our memories are not as good. And so I think technologies are all about a certain amount of like, it's a combination of like enhancing our abilities as well as kind of sometimes creating trade-offs of like, okay, maybe the fact that, and we are now much more mobile in the sense we can drive very far or fly very far, that shrinks the distance between people, but maybe makes us less sedentary. And so we don't exercise. We're not walking as much or even riding bicycles or things like that. I would say, but actually related to bicycles in terms of like, perhaps that's the right way to think about the story of technology, so back in, I think it was like the late 1970s, early 80s, Steve Jobs referred to the computer as the bicycle for the mind. And so the idea behind this was that, I think he was reading a Scientific American article, and in it there was this chart where it was looking at kind of the energy efficiency of different animals. And so I think like maybe some birds are really efficient and humans were kind of mediocre. But they also included a human with a bicycle in that chart. And it turns out once you put a human on a bicycle, things change, and humans are much, much more efficient than I think anything else in the animal kingdom. And the idea behind this, Jobs' argument, is like computers are kind of a bicycle for the mind. Like it kind of just allows us to be that much more efficient. And I think that the best version of kind of technology is that all these technologies are bicycles. They kind of take abilities that humans have, whether it's manipulating information, whether it's mobility or creates certain things around creativity. These things are things that we can do, and technology kind of enhances that. They kind of act as bicycles to kind of make us that much more energy efficient or do more in less time. And so this is kind of related to like productivity and certain ideas of progress. And so I think that's kind of the best case version of what technology can be. Now, of course, it's not always that. But when done well, I think it really can provide those kinds of advances. But I think, but going back to what we were talking about of like, oh, like what is uniquely human, what is not, and especially with AI, it's becoming increasingly clear that I don't know how much is going to be unique. I think for me, it's less about the uniqueness and much more about kind of what are the quintessential features that we view as our own humanity. And of course, I mean, and I think that kind of thing is actually, it's a personal thing of like, what are the things that I derive the most meaning and fulfillment out of? Is it thinking well? Is it spending time with my family? Or whatever it is. And ultimately, you want technology, whether it's AI technology or just kind of technology more broadly, to kind of make us the best versions of ourselves, where we have more time to spend doing those kinds of things, or we can kind of do those kinds of things better, as opposed to replacing those kinds of things. So like, I would not want a technology to like basically like replace me in terms of like spending time with my family. And if you really get lots of pleasure out of thinking, which I really enjoy, like I want AI to kind of make that a more rewarding experience, as opposed to me just kind of outsourcing it to some sort of technology. And so for me, I think there's kind of the best version of, okay, how do we kind of use these technologies as bicycles, kind of enhancing these things? But also it requires a certain amount of deliberateness of saying, okay, like how do we as humans get fulfillment and meaning? And certainly if like certain stories around what AI is going to do, where suddenly like humans are not going to need to work and we're going to live in some weird post-scarcity world or whatever, which is maybe kind of like the best case version. There's many people who worry about like destruction of humanity and things like that. We have to have these conversations as a society sooner rather than later around, okay, what are the things that I want to do? And like what each of us want to do. And so for me, the story of technology is a combination of kind of the bicycle nature of technology, as well as hopefully constantly having this conversation around what do we derive meaning from, and how do we think about like ourselves and what we want, like how we want to live, and then how do we choose the technology that kind of, or build the technology that enhances those kinds of things rather than lessens them.
Yeah, it seems that we're at that cross point, right? We're at the pivotal moment where we can truly anchor to that idea, Sam, of using these technologies to enhance our meaning-making abilities or to lessen them, because those two are just as powerful right now. It seems as though we can outsource our thinking, or we can really expand it and unleash it. And so hopefully with that message that you just sent out to all of us, we can anchor to that. And are you seeing that? Like, are you in the broader societal scale, are you seeing us trying to leverage and unleash our creativity, our, meaning-making abilities, or are you seeing just, laziness flourish and thrive?
So I would say, I mean, certainly there's a lot of laziness. I feel like the kind of like the path of least resistance is something that humans have always been good at taking. So I don't want to kind of I don't want to minimize that kind of thing. At the same time, though, I definitely see lots of hints of this other path. And so whether or not, and going back to science, of like tools to kind of enhance our scientific discovery, or computers that are, rather than kind of isolating us, people are thinking about computers that are kind of much more physically embedded in spaces. And what does that mean? And actually, does it create more like physical collaboration and interaction with other human beings? There are people working on these kinds of things. And so for me, seeing these kinds of tools that enhance our creativity, enhance our interaction with others, that kind of say, okay, like rather than trying to, I guess like remove kind of the humanity from the world, saying no, we are deeply human creatures. Like we have certain features. I mean, we want to kind of be the best versions of ourselves, but that doesn't necessarily mean avoiding the humanity and the things that give us joy and meaning and fulfillment. And so I definitely do see hints of those. And unfortunately, sometimes they're more hints rather than like huge trends. But there definitely are. And so, for example, I mean, so I mentioned the kind of like certain aspects of physical computing. But even when it comes to the internet, I mean, when we think about the web, we think about like these massive like social media tools and things like that kind of maybe elide our humanity. But alongside that, there's a number of people who talk about this idea of the poetic web, or kind of this like fun, playful websites that really are just delightful and almost celebratory. And people are trying to make those kinds of things. And so I definitely see movements kind of at the intersection of like democratization of code, or kind of the poetic web, or kind of physical computing, or whatever. Like there are many attempts to do these kinds of things. And for me, I think it's a matter of just kind of being aware of them and saying, like, as a society, maybe, no, these are the things we actually want to choose, as opposed to the things that are kind of just being pushed at us, or kind of, or are the paths of least resistance.
Yeah, it's gonna be a very exciting future for sure, and definitely we'll see what it unfolds to, and hopefully we won't outsource, because there's a lot of power within us. And so if we truly leverage those technologies, which were at the end of the day created by us, that speaks about us a lot. So Sam, this has been a true pleasure. It was very, I enjoyed a lot listening to you, and I'm going to share your work with our listeners, and hopefully they also dive into your ideas of science, wonder, and technology. So Sam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And yeah, I had a lot of fun chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.